A girl of 19 with the whole of what she owned lashed under a wagon sheet. A stepmother already counting the good rooms of the home place hers behind a barred door, and a single folded deed to a steep box canyon of standing pine that the entire camp swore could never be gotten out over the rim, nor down the creek, nor by any other earthly means. That was the whole of the estate that came down to Juniah Calder on the raw gray autumn morning this story begins. And any man in the mining camp of Cinnabar would have told you, kindly and to your face, that it summed to exactly nothing. Every man in Cinnabar was wrong. That worthless box of timber, the one the ox teamsters laughed at because there was no road up to it and no road down out of it, and no way a man had ever found to bring a felled log over the rim or through the boulders the creek came down in, was going to make her the richest single holding in the whole district. Not someday. Not slow. But inside one single burning boom year. The year of fire ate the timbering deep in the Buckhorn and killed the biggest mine in the district dead in its own shaft until it could be retimbered. The year the narrow gauge railroad came clawing up the valley in a race against the snow, with a hunger for ties and trestle stringers that no near slope could feed. Because every near slope had already been slashed to stumps, and every other good stand of pine for 40 miles was burned off or snowed in or bought up and cornered before she ever swung an axe. And the soft pink land agent who laughed across his counter and pressed $40 on her for the folly as a kindness would ride up that very canyon himself before the next snow flew, his hat held against his chest and a syndicate's money folded in his coat and thousands of dollars on his tongue, to ask her please to sell it back. She would name him his own $40 for the whole of it, with the ledger open on the table between them, and she would tell him she would sell for exactly that, the day the creek ran dry and the last pine fell. That is where this story is going, and it earns every cold mile of the road there. If you have ever been handed the one thing that nobody else in the world wanted and made it worth more than everything they were so careful to keep, then do me a kindness before we begin. Tap that like button and tell me down in the comments what country you're listening from tonight, because I do like to know how far these stories carry over the mountains. It was the tale of autumn in 1881, high in the Rocky Mountains, in a raw new mining camp called Cinnabar, that had grown up in a matter of 3 years along a narrow valley floor where a fast, cold creek came down out of the peaks to meet the wagon road, a camp of 1 bank and 3 saloons, and a mercantile, and an assay office, and a church that was not finished, and a great deal of mud, strung out under mountainsides that climbed away steep and dark and shaggy with pine on every hand. The silver was in the rock up the gulches, and the whole life of the place ran on timber the way a body runs on bread. Timber to shore the shafts and lag the drifts, and crib the stopes deep in the mountain. Timber to build the camp and burn in its stoves and feed the boilers of the stamp mills that pounded day and night down the valley until the ground itself seemed to have a heartbeat. And that autumn, for the first time, there was a new thing being talked of on the mercantile porch, a thing the older hands did not quite know the taste of yet, which was the railroad, the narrow gauge. The little mountain line that had been creeping up the canyons from the plains for 2 years, and whose survey stakes had just that summer begun to appear down at the low end of the valley, a line of them marching up out of the south with red rag flags on their tops, promising that within a year, maybe 2, the cars would come grinding right up into the camp itself and change everything they touched. The old men on the porch chewed on it and did not agree. Some said the road would never make the last hard grade. Some said it would come and make them all rich. And 1 or 2 of the quietest of them said the thing that turned out to be true, which was that a railroad does not run on rails alone, that every mile of the little line would want its 1,000 ties cut and hewn and its trestles built of sound mountain timber, and that the camp had best look to its woodlots, because a road that came hungry for timber into a country that had already cut its easy. Timber off was going to make lumber worth its weight in something a good deal better than sawdust. Absalom Calder had been dead 11 days when the will was read. He had been the quietest woodsman in the district and maybe in the mountains. A lean, weathered, unhurried man with pale, steady eyes and a way of standing a long while looking at a slope of trees before he ever set the saw to one of them. A man who ran a small, honest sawmill on a good lot down on the valley grade and cut cordwood and mine props and rough lumber and was known to deal square and to talk about 1 word in 10. He had come up to the mountains a widower with a small daughter and had made a place cutting timber where other men grabbed at silver. And he had married again, 4 years back, a handsome, upright valley woman named Lavinia, who had buried one husband already and knew the price of everything on God's earth to the penny. He took a lung fever in the wet cold of that late autumn, cutting in the rain when he ought to have been by a stove. And he was gone inside of a week, gone at 50-odd with an apology to the doctor for the trouble. And the whole camp said, what a pity. A steady man like that. And then went back to talking about the survey stakes. When the will was read out at the kitchen table of the home place, it went about the way the camp expected. Because Lavinia Calder was not a woman who left much to chance. The home place passed to her whole and entire. The tight, snug house, the barn, and best of all, the good sawmill lot down on the valley grade. The level ground beside the road with the mill and the mill pond and the standing sheds and the whole apparatus of a going timber business. The one truly valuable thing Absalom Calder had put together in his mild, unhurried life. All of that to the second wife. What was left over for the daughter of the first marriage was 1 folded square of paper, and it was a paper Lavinia would not have troubled to keep if it had been the last deed in the territory. She did not simply hand it across the table. She rose and came round to where the girl sat, and she pressed the deed into Junia's palm and folded the girl's own fingers shut over it with both her cool, dry hands, the way a lady presses a coin on a beggar in front of the neighbors so the giving will be seen and remembered. And she said the single thing she troubled to say to her that whole morning. There is your father's folly, she said, in a voice with no heat in it at all, which was worse than heat. You are welcome to every stick of it. See what you can log off it that he never could. Then she turned back to her chair and her lawyer and her good rooms, and the matter, so far as Lavinia Calder was concerned, was closed, and a girl of 19 sat at the only kitchen table she had ever belonged to, holding a deed to a canyon that the whole camp used as the very byword for a fool's ground. Everyone in Cinnabar knew what the folly was. 6 years back, Absalom Calder had paid good hard money at the land office for a steep box canyon that opened off the high side of the valley, 3 hours hard climb above the camp. A narrow gorge of a place, walled on 3 sides by cliffs a man could not get a horse up, choked along its floor with great tumbled granite boulders the size of cabins, and standing full from its creek to its rim with pine. And such pine. Tall, straight, clean, bold mountain pine, red-barked and close-grained and sound, an unbroken stand of it climbing the slopes on either side of the water. Thousands upon thousands of trees that had never heard an axe, more good saw timber any cruiser would grant you than a man could cut in a lifetime. And every stick of it worthless, the camp said, because you could not get it out. There was no way in for a road. The canyon's mouth was a slot the creek came boiling out of, and its walls were sheer. There was no way over the rim. You could not skid a log up a cliff. And there was no getting a log down that creek by any means known to teamster or logger. because the creek came down the canyon fast and steep and mean, dropping in white steps and boiling around those house-sized boulders in a way that would splinter a log to kindling and drown any man fool enough to follow it in. The near slopes above the camp, the gentle ones a man could throw a road onto and skid his logs down with an ox team, those were the slopes that got cut, and by that autumn they were mostly cut off, slashed gray and stumpy for a mile around the camp. But Calder's Canyon, the box of good pine you could see and could not touch, stood there full and green and untouched, a whole fortune of timber locked behind cliffs and boulders, and the men on the porch had named it years back and never tired of the name. Calder's Folly, they called it, 6 years of taxes paid on trees no man could ever bring to market, and they would ask Absalom, grave and friendly, whether he meant to log the clouds this year or only pasture the rimrock. He let them laugh. He had been laughed at before and had noticed it cost him nothing, and most every Sunday after church, in his good dark coat and his wide brown hat, he hitched the mule and rode up the long climb to his folly with a chain and a level and a notebook and a cold dinner. And he measured. He measured for years, and what the camp never once troubled to ride up and see, because it never once occurred to the camp that there was anything up there to see but a rich man's mistake, was the thing this whole story turns upon. And it lived now in the girl's memory as she sat at the table with the deed cooling in her hand, because her father had shown it to her himself, more Sundays than she could count. The camp had it exactly backward, and Absalom Calder had known it for 6 years. They all thought the only way a log ever left a mountain was over land, dragged by oxen down a skid road or hauled on a wagon, and by that measure the canyon was indeed a folly, for there was no land road into it or out of it, and never could be. But there was a road down out of that canyon, a broad, fast, tireless road that ran the whole length of it and cost nothing and never wore out, and it was the very creek they all said made the place impossible. The creek was the way. Junia's father had walked that water in every season, chain and level and notebook in hand, and he had proved to his own patient satisfaction what almost no man in that district would have believed, that the canyon's curse was its fortune stood on its head. The very steepness that would splinter a loose log was a steepness that would carry a floated one faster than any ox on earth. A man could not fight that creek, but he could harness it. High up the canyon, where the water gathered before its long plunge, Absalom had begun to build a splash dam, a heavy timber dam thrown across the gorge to pond the creek and bank up a great standing head of water behind it, so that when its gate was tripped the whole pent flood would go down the canyon in one roaring push, and float and shove and carry the season's felled and decked logs down ahead of it in an ordered drive. And below the worst of the boulders, where a loose drive would still hang and jam and smash, he had surveyed a flume, a long timber trough on trestle legs, pitched at the exact fall the water wanted, to carry the logs sluicing smooth and sure down the last steep miles to a landing built on the level valley grade, where a wagon or a rail siding could take them away. A splash dam to make the water, a flume to tame it, and the creek itself to do all the hauling for free. Pine that no ox could ever drag out could be floated and sluiced down to market on water power alone, cheaper than any timber in the district, and there was a whole locked canyon of it. He had half built the dam. He had run the flume line and driven his stakes the length of the creek, true surveyed stakes standing at every station with the grade marked on them. And he had filled a notebook, Sunday by patient Sunday, with the figures that proved it out, the fall of the creek measured station by station. the flow of the water gauged in the high snow melt of June and the low black cold of January. The board feet of timber cruised and tallied slope by slope, and the plain reckoning of how many thousand feet of pine that water could sluice down to the valley in a single day of driving. Every figure of it set down in ink, in his small, square, unhurried hand, because that was the mother of all his rules, and the one he had drilled into his daughter past forgetting, that you write every figure down in ink the moment you have it, every inch of fall, every board foot, every dime, and every egg, because a figure set down in ink cannot shift on you in the night the way a remembered one always will. Timber you can float, he told her once, mild, screwing the cap back on his ink, in a country busy cutting off all the timber it can reach, will be worth more than the mill lot someday. And he taught her, Sunday on Sunday, up that canyon, to read a slope of trees and a run of water together, which pine would float and which was too heavy in the butt, where the creek would carry and where it would jam, how to read a grade with a level and set a stake true. It was Junia, all 4 years of the second marriage, who had quietly kept the paying books of the little mill and the woodlot, while Lavinia kept the parlor, tallying the cordwood and the mine props and the rough lumber, and her own eggs and butter in a square hand her father had trained. So the woman who folded the girl's fingers shut over the deed that morning was turning out of doors, though it would be a hard winter before she understood it. The one soul on the whole place who could read what her father had spent 6 laughed-at years proving in the rock and the water of that canyon. Junia did not weep at the table. She rose and put the deed away inside her coat against her ribs where a paper belongs, and she went and hitched her father's old mule to his old spring wagon. Lavinia let her take both, not from mercy, but because they were past their best, and the letting go of them would read as generosity to the neighbors. And Lavinia Calder never in her life let go of a thing that did not read, in the letting, as finer than it was. And Junia drove, not up toward the mountains, but straight down the muddy length of the camp to the squared log and stone front of the bank, because paper before axes was her father's law. You prove the title clean before you spend $1 working the ground it stands for. The bank and the land agency in Cinnabar were the same soft desk, and the man behind it was Bartholomew Rennick, who was banker and land agent and notary, all in one comfortable person, pink and round and easy in a good broadcloth coat, with a heavy gold watch chain slung across the front of him like a log chain across a gap, a man who priced every soul who came through his door in one single downward glance, and never afterward troubled to price them twice. He had priced Absalom Calder years back at not much, a dreamer with a rock full of trees he'd never fell, and he priced the daughter cheaper, a girl with a dead dreamer's canyon, and no man to stand for her. But he took the deed when she laid it on his counter, because paper was his trade and he was good at it, and he read it over with a great deal more care than his comfortable face let on, and what he found was exactly what she had ridden down to hear. The title clean, the filing true, the taxes paid to the very year, the whole Box Canyon passing plain and entire out of her father's name and into hers with never a flaw in it anywhere. Then Bartholomew Rennick leaned back off his counter and laughed, low and easy from under the watch chain, and made her the offer that this whole story hangs upon, the offer men in Cinnabar would repeat to one another with a wince all through the year that followed. $40, he said, and I call that handsome. Out of pure respect for your father, rest him. It is the only offer that folly will ever draw in this life, child. Let me take it off your hands, and you go hire out somewhere respectable and warm before the snow. Junia took the deed back off the counter, squared its fold and put it away again inside her coat, and told him, level, unhurried, in the plain voice of a body finishing an ordinary errand and not refusing a kindness, that she was obliged to him for confirming the title, which was the whole of what she had come down to learn. Something dry moved behind the banker's comfort at that, because a kindness declined is a thing a man like Rennick files in a bottom drawer and does not forget. But he only smiled and told the room she'd learn the hard way. They always did. Out behind the mercantile, out of the wind and out of the watching, Junia counted her money. It lived in a tobacco tin that had been her father's, and it was woodlot and egg money, careful money, saved a dime and 2 bits at a time out of cordwood she had split and hens she had kept, while Lavinia never once troubled to notice the work getting done. And it came, counted twice in the cold, to $41. 41. She sat a moment with the open tin on her knee and let the figure be exactly what it was, and let herself feel the plain hard shape of it. The girl the whole camp had just finished pitying owned, by her own honest count, $1 more than the banker's entire opinion of her inheritance and everything on it. 41 against his 40, and she meant, starting from that $1 margin, to widen it into a sum the district would choke on. There was one man on the mercantile porch, as she rolled the wagon back past it, who did not laugh with the others, an old timber cruiser named Silas Orne, gaunt and gray and near 70, who had cruised and marked and estimated pine all over these mountains back before the camp had a name, and who leaned on the porch rail with his cold pipe and watched the gray wagon climb away up the north road out of camp with his pale sharp eyes, and said not one single word. And there is generally, in any camp, one old man who says nothing, and he is generally the one worth the listening. She did not turn the mule toward any warm hired place. She turned it up the long hard climb toward the canyon, 3 hours of switchback road that gave out to a rutted 2-track her father's own Sunday wheels had worn into the timber, and then to no track at all, and she came up the last steep pitch in the failing light of that short autumn day, with the cold coming down off the peaks, and the mouth of the box canyon opened dark and close before her, the creek boiling white out of its slot, and the walls of pine climbing away steep on either hand into the early dusk. She led the mule in along the water as far as a body could go, past the first of the great boulders, up to the flat bench where her father had made his camp. And there in the last gray light she found the thing that closed her throat, his Sundays, waiting for her in the dark. Below the bench, keyed into the rock of the gorge, stood the splash dam half built, its heavy timber face raised a third of the way across the creek, and its great gate framed and hung and waiting. And downstream she could just make out the line of his flume stakes marching away into the trees, true and plumb, the grade marked on each one in his hand, the strings between them long gone, but the stakes standing faithful. There were sound logs decked and skidded and stacked by size, 2 and 3 to a Sunday, 6 years of quiet work. There was a low pole shelter and a stone hearth. She got down stiff from the wagon and walked the lines he had laid in the near dark, and knelt at the cold rushing creek and put her bare hand down into the water. That hard, fast, cold water her father had spent 6 laughed at years proving would carry his pine to market, and held it there until it ached. And if she wept then, the cold wind took it dry off her face, and no soul in this world was owed the seeing of it. She did not stay knelt long, for there was a little light left, and the cold was real. She pitched the wagon sheet over the pole ridge in the lee of the rock, penned the mule, and made a small fire of the dead pine that lay everywhere for the gathering, and ate cold bread by it, while the last gray drained out of the slot of sky overhead, and the creek went on roaring in the dark, the way it had roared for 10,000 years before anyone was alive to call it a folly. And before she let herself sleep, she took out her father's notebook and turned past all his years of Sunday figures to the last page his hand had ever written. The last flow of the creek he had set down, gauged in his small square ink not 3 weeks before the fever took him, and just beneath it, in the same hand he had taught her, she wrote the day, the date, the miles up, the $41 in the tin, the mule, the half-built dam, and the standing flume line as she found them. And below the figures she wrote the plan, plain as a dam is plain. Because a thing you set down in ink cannot shift on you in the night, raise and finish the splash dam and bank the water. Build the flume down the creek to a landing on the valley grade, fell and deck the straight pine through the winter. And in the spring, on the creek's own power and no ox at all, drive the timber down and sell it. To a camp that burned timber like bread. To mines that would want it deeper every year. And to a railroad she could feel coming up the valley in her bones. A railroad that would want more sound pine than all the slashed-off near slopes could ever. Give it again. She capped the ink and closed the book on it, and lay down in her blankets in the roaring cold dark, with the deed and the notebook under the corner of her bedroll, and $1's proud margin keeping her company in the tin, and she listened a long while to the creek going down the canyon in the black. That fast, cold, tireless water everyone swore made the place impossible. The very water that was going to carry her out of nothing and into the whole of what was coming. And somewhere before the fire burned down she slept. And in the morning, when it was light enough to lay a hand to the first timber of the dam, the work would begin. The cold woke her before the light did. The deep, still cold that pools in the bottom of a box canyon on a mountain night and does not lift until the sun has climbed clear over the eastern rim. And Junia Calder lay a while in it under her blankets, with her breath standing white above her face, and listened to the one sound that never quit down in that cleft, the low rushing talk of the creek going over stone in the dark. She did not throw off the blankets and go find the axe. Her father had taught her that a tree felled wrong is a tree paid for twice, once to fell it and once to buck the ruin of it out of your way, and that a dam keyed into the wrong ground is worse than no dam at all, and that a morning spent looking is never a morning lost. So on that first full day of her ownership, she did what Absalom Calder would have done, which was nothing that showed. She took up his ledger and a whittled rod marked off in feet and inches, and she pulled her father's Mackinaw close about her, and she walked her canyon from the boulder-choked mouth clear up to the falls beneath the rim, and she read it. She read the pitch of it first, because everything in that canyon began and ended with the fall of the water. The creek came off the high snowfields in a white hurry, dropping steep and hard the whole length of the cleft, gathering into pools and then breaking over ledges and running on. And a creek that steep was a curse to every man who had ever stood at the mouth and called the timber unloggable, because you could no more raft a log down that boulder race than you could raft it down a flight of stairs. But her father had seen the other face of it, and had spent his Sundays proving it, and had written the proof in the book she carried against her ribs, that a creek steep enough to smash a log was a creek steep enough to carry one, if a body would only bank the water up behind a dam and then let it go all at once in a made flood, a wall of water that would float the pine over the rocks that would have broken it. Steepness was the whole problem, and steepness was the whole answer, and only a man patient enough to measure had ever seen that the one was the other. And everywhere she walked that morning, she found his Sundays waiting for her in the timber and the stone, the same as she had found them the night before in the dark. His blazes stood old and heeled over on the trees along the flume line, a faint axe mark every few rods running true down the grade. His survey stakes marched down the creek where the trough was to hang. His figures in the book told her the fall of the land foot by foot, the flow of the creek measured in the melt, and measured again in the low cold water of autumn, the count of standing pine to the acre, and the bored feet in 100 trees he had felled in his mind and never touched with a saw. She checked his numbers against the ground the way he had taught her to check anything before she trusted $1 or a day to it. And she found them right, all of them right, all but one. He had staked his splash dam low, down where the canyon floor opened out a little and the creek ran wide and shallow over a gravel flat. Because it was the easy place, the place a man could throw a dam across without fighting the rock. Junia stood on that staked flat a long while in the cold, with her hand flat on a boulder, and read the ground the way her father in his mildness had somehow never made himself read it. And she saw the thing he had missed. A dam thrown across that wide flat would make a wide, shallow pond, broad as a meadow and nowhere deep. And a wide, shallow pond banks a poor head of water. It gives you acres of surface for the sun and the seep to steal from, and no depth to hold a driving flood behind. 200 feet upstream the canyon pinched to a stone throat where the granite walls stepped in close on either hand, and a dam keyed into that throat would be 1/3 the length and twice the height, and would back the water up deep and narrow between the walls. A true working head, a made lake she could hold and then loose in one gray wall down the creek when the flume was full of logs and wanting it. It would cost her a harder dig into living rock, and a taller crib, and the moving of stone her father had not meant to move. She moved it. And that night by the tallow light she wrote under his last figure, the first figure of her own keeping, the one place in all that ground where the daughter bettered the father. And she did not feel proud so much as she felt continued by it, as if the two of them were still arguing timber across a jolting wagon seat and she had at last, and quietly, taken a point off him. Then she went to work, and the work was the whole of her life from that first hard frost down through the short days toward the snow, and it was work about water and timber both. Every stroke of it, done alone with a mule and $40-odd in a tobacco tin and a dead man's book. She began with the dam, because nothing floated until the dam held. She felled the crib timbers first and dragged them down with the mule and notched and pinned them into a great box of logs keyed hard into the rock of the throat on either side, and she filled the box with stone barred loose off the walls, and then she faced the whole upstream side with earth and puddled it, dug the clay out of a bank down the canyon, and hauled it and beat it into the seams in wet courses, working it stiff with sifted gravel the way her father's notebook set the mixture down, treading it and tamping it until the face would carry a standing head of water and weep almost none of it away. She built the gate into the low middle of it out of squared plank and iron, a heavy sluice gate she could raise with a lever and a chain to let the banked flood out all at once and drop again to bank the next, and she hung it and worked it dry a dozen times until it ran sweet in its slot. And when the first hard rains and the last of the high melt came down, and the pool began to fill behind it, and stand deep and green and quiet between the granite walls where a week before there had been only white water hurrying over stone, she measured the depth of it every evening with the marked rod and wrote the figure down, because a figure set down in ink cannot shift on you in the night the way a remembered one will. Then the flume, and the chute below it, for the dam was only half the machine and the trough was the other half. From the dam down along the creek she hung a flume, a long V of whipsawed plank carried on trestle bents where the ground fell away and pinned to the rock where it did not, pitched just steep enough to carry a log on a run of water and no steeper, following the old blazed line her father had surveyed. Where the canyon choked down through its worst quarter-mile of house-sized boulders, the stretch that had made every idle man at the camp swear the pine could never be gotten out, she did not try to carry the flume through the rock at all. She built a chute, a plank slide bedded on the boulders themselves and greased and watered, to shoot the logs down past the choke to where the flume could take them up again below. And at the bottom of it all, down where the canyon mouth opened at last onto the valley grade near the pale scar where the railroad survey had begun to creep up the valley, she built her landing, a broad decked platform of timber where the logs would come off the water and be caught and stacked and held out of the creek up on the flat, ready for whatever wagon or car should ever come to take them. She trusted no joint of it to memory. She measured the fall of the flume foot by foot and wrote it down, and she reckoned from the pitch and the depth of the trough and the head of water behind the gate the one figure the whole winter's labor turned upon. How many thousand board feet of pine that flume could sluice down to the landing between one dawn and one dark on a single loosed head of water. And she worked that sum 3 times on 3 evenings and wrote it plain in the front of the book, and looked at it a long while, because that number was the answer to a question the camp had not yet thought to ask. And when the works were built, she went up and cut the first tree, to prove the whole of it end to end, before she ever trusted it with a season. She chose a straight sound pine standing clean of limb for 40 feet, and she notched it and felled it exactly where she meant it to lie, and limbed it and bucked it to length, and rolled it with the cant hook, and skidded it down to the head of the flume behind the straining mule, and she raised the gate. The banked head came down the creek in a low gray wall the way her father's figures had promised it would, and it took the log and floated it over the rocks that would have splintered it dry, and ran it down the flume, and shot it down the greased chute past the boulder choke, and set it at last, wet and whole and steaming a little in the cold, on the deck of the landing at the valley grade. One straight pine brought a mile down a canyon that a whole camp swore no log would ever leave, on nothing but the fall of the land and the weight of the water and a dead man's patient arithmetic. She stood over it a while and did not let herself smile, because one log was not a season, and a thing is not proved until it is proved many times. But she took out the book, and she wrote it down. The first line of board feet delivered, the first figure in the whole ledger that was timber come down instead of labor gone up, and she capped the ink and went to fell the next. And she learned her creek the way her father had drilled into her past forgetting, which was the thing that made her his daughter more than any joint she pinned or any tree she dropped. With the marked rod she measured the flow of the water by the day, in the fat melt and in the low cold shrink of the season, and wrote it down. She timed how long the gate took to bank a driving head behind the dam, and how fast that head drew down once loosed, and reckoned from it how many drives of logs she could run down the flume between one filling and the next. She learned which pines stood straight and clean and sound, and which were shaken or punky at the heart, and cruised her own timber acre by acre the way old Silas Orne cruised a mountain, and set down the board feet standing in her canyon to a figure she could stand behind. Because a figure set down cannot shift on you the way a hope will. She was not only building. In the hours she could steal from the dam and the flume, she was making the canyon a place a body could live through a mountain winter, because a woman who freezes in November logs no pine in December. She dug a dugout back into the dry south bank under the rim and faced its front with fitted stone and squared timber, and floored it and roofed it with slab and sod and earth, and set a stone hearth in the back of it drawing up through the bank, so that where the raw cold had stood there was now a low, snug cabin dug into the mountain, warm against the worst the sky could do, with a plank door and one small window looking down the canyon toward the landing and the valley grade below. She built a pole shed and a little corral for the mule out of the everlasting supply of poles, and put up hay cut from the one grassy bench above the falls. And on the good black bottom soil down by the creek, in the last of the open weather, she broke a garden and planted what would keep, turnip and squash and late greens, and banked a root cellar into the bank beside the cabin, so that by the time the snow came there were things put by on the floor of a canyon the whole district called dead timber and worthless rock. And all the while she built and dug and measured, she was reading the other thing, the thing that made the whole cold gamble worth the sweat of it, and it was written plainer across the district every week she came down for staples and iron. She read it the way her father had taught her to read a flow, not with her hopes, which wanted it, but with her eyes and her figures. She read that the deep mines were going into a hard, dry, dangerous season, the big workings driving deeper every month, the buckhorn deepest of all, timbering their shafts and their stopes and their long drifts with more and more wood, and doing it faster and more careless the deeper and richer they cut, and that a dry summer laid over a mountain of dry mine timber 1,000 feet down in the dark was a fire waiting on nothing but a spark and a draft. She read that the easy timber was going, the accessible slopes near the camp, the near hills a man could log with a team and a wagon and no dam and no flume at all, were already slashed off and cut out and hauled away, the low ground stripped, so that every month the wood the mines and the town burned and buried had to come from farther off and cost more to fetch. And she read, plainest of all, the things standing up in stakes and grade cuts down in the valley below her own landing. The narrow-gauge railroad was racing up the valley to reach the camp before the snow shut the passes, laying its iron mile by mile toward the ore that was waiting to ride down out of the mountains. And a railroad is a river of wood before it is ever a road of iron. It eats ties by the thousand, and it wants trestle timber by the mountain to carry its track across every gulch and draw in a country that is nothing but gulch and draw, and every foot of that timber had to be gettable, sound, and near. Dry mines timbering deeper, easy slopes cut out, a railroad starving for wood and running out of winter. She wrote the three of them down on one page like three flows converging on one channel, and she did not need her father's stick to see where the water was going to rise. There was one other soul in that whole camp who read the same page, and the camp laughed at him for it exactly as it laughed at her. Silas Orne was an old timber cruiser, gaunt and stooped and near 70, who had walked and tallied standing timber across those mountains back before the camp had a name, and he sat most afternoons on the mercantile porch with his back to the log wall and read the year aloud to the young miners and teamsters lounging there in the thin, cold sun, and told them plainly what was coming. He told them the mines were timbering deeper and greener and more careless every month, and that he had smelled that smell before. The year a big working burned its own guts out down in the dark and killed 40 men and stood dead a season for want of timber to shore it up again. He told them the near slopes were cut out, and any fool with 2 eyes could see the wood coming from farther every week. He told them the rail contracts were let, that he had heard the tie and trestle figures himself, a mountain of wood wanted and a deadline of snow to want it by, and that when a country's mines and a country's railroad both cry for timber in the same dry season, the price of a sound stick of pine does a thing that men who have always had timber cheap cannot even picture until it is on top of them. And the young men on the porch laughed, the easy laugh of men to whom wood had always been the one thing there was too much of, and one of them jerked his chin up valley toward the dark cleft of Calder's Folly, and said the old cruiser ought to go partners with the girl who was up there building a sawmill for squirrels. And the porch laughed again. All of them. At the old man and the folly girl both. At the two people in the district who had done the arithmetic. Junia heard it, loading her sack of beans into the wagon, and she did not so much as turn her head, because she had a use for that laughter now, and it was not to argue with it. Let them laugh at Silas Orne. Every figure the old man read off the porch was a figure already standing in her book, and a thing two people see and a whole camp laughs at is generally a thing about to come true. She had one last thing to buy, and near her last money to buy it with. An outfit east of the camp had gone broke and was selling out ahead of the winter, and among the tired horses and the worn harness at the auction there was the very stuff she could not fell or whipsaw or beat out of the canyon with her own two hands and a dead man's book, a coil of good wire cable, sound and heavy, for rigging her skids and her chute, a stack of saw steel, blades and plate for the whipsaw and the crosscut, worth more to her than gold with a whole winter of felling ahead, and a keg of flume iron, the spikes and straps and bolts and gate fittings that held a plank trough together against the shove of water and log. She drove down to the sale and bid on those three things and nothing else, and before she raised her hand on any of it she went over every foot the way her father had gone over a thing before he trusted $1 to it, sighted the cable for broken strands, and thumbed the saw steel for temper and true, and turned the iron over in her cold hands to feel its sound. And she paid nearly the last of her tin for it, cash on the barrelhead, and wrote the figures in the book, out and out and out, all still going out and none yet come back, and hauled it up the valley behind the straining mule and set it in place, and finished her works. And then, near the end of it, with the first real snow already gray on the high peaks above the rim, and her flume hung, and her dam holding, and her landing decked, and her first pines lying proved and wet upon it, she stood one still cold morning at the mouth of her canyon, where it opened on the valley grade and looked down on the whole country below, and saw the two things she had read coming standing up at last in the world where any eye could see them. Far off across the camp, above the black head frame of the Buckhorn, the mine smoke stood up thicker than she had ever seen it. The smoke of a big deep working driving hard and dry into the mountain through a season that had not given it rain, and nearer, down along the pale scar in the valley bottom, a line of fresh survey stakes ran up toward the camp out of the timber below, the narrow gauge, closer than it had been a month ago, racing its iron up the valley toward the winter, hungry for a mountain of ties and trestle wood, and not yet knowing, no more than the mines knew, no more than the whole laughing camp knew, that the only sure timber left standing near enough to matter in the hard year coming stood behind a splash dam in Calder's Folly, cut and decked and waiting, with every board foot of it already written down in ink. Junia Calder closed the book on her figures and put it away inside her coat against her ribs, and went back up the canyon to fell the next pine, and the snow held off one more day, and the crisis that all her winter's work was built to meet had not yet broken. The smoke that had stood thin and steady over the Buckhorn shaft house all through that first cold month, ordinary smoke, hoist smoke, the breath of a mine driving 3 shifts against the coming winter, did not stay thin. It happened in the black middle of a night late in the fall, when the creek in Junia Calder's canyon had already grown its first fringe of shore ice, and the pines stood powdered white to the timberline, and she came out of the dugout at the sound of the whole valley waking wrong, bells and a mine whistle held down long past any shift change, and stood at the lip of her canyon in her blanket and watched a red glow climb up out of the earth 2 miles down the grade where no red glow had any business being. A mine does not burn the way a house burns, All at once and out in the open where a man can fight it, a mine burns down inside itself. In the dark, in the timbering, in the thousands upon thousands of squared pine sets and lagging and stull that hold the rock apart so men can walk in the hollow of the mountain. And once the fire is in the timbers of a deep working, there is nothing on God's earth to do but seal it off and starve it and let it eat what it can reach. And then, when it is cold, go down into the wet, stinking ruin of it and find the whole skeleton of the mine burned to charcoal. The drifts caved where the sets let go. The shafts choked, the ore standing rich and useless behind 100 fathoms of fallen rock that no man can reach until the whole mountain is timbered new from the sump to the collar. That was the Buckhorn by morning, the biggest mine in the district, the mine that made the payroll the whole camp lived on, killed not dead but sleeping, its ore locked in the dark behind burned wood. And every man who owned a share in it or drew a wage from it, understanding in the same gray dawn the single brutal fact of their winter, the Buckhorn would not lift another ton of pay rock until it was re-timbered from the bottom up. And re-timbering the Buckhorn would take more sound pine than the whole camp had cut in a year. And it took that pine in the one season there was none to be had. This was the part old Silas Orne had stood on the mercantile porch and prophesied to a laughing camp all through the summer. And it came true now, all at once, and from 3 sides, the way the true dry things always come. The near slopes above the camp had been slashed and cut out years back for the first careless timbering in the cordwood and the cabins, cut clean and left in a rack of dry slash. And that same fall a slash fire had run up the eastern benches and burned off what green pine still stood there, so that the accessible timber was ash. The high country, where good pine still stood black and thick along the far ridges, was already shut. The first heavy snows had come early and deep in the passes, and no crew could get a saw up there, nor a log down till the spring thaw broke the drifts. And spring was 5 months and a dead payroll away. And what sound gettable pine remained in the whole district at a haulable distance had been quietly bought up over the summer and locked in the hand of the timber syndicate out of Denver. The same cool money that had been buying failed claims and mortgaged bottoms all year, and the syndicate, reading the same disaster everyone else read but reading it a day sooner, had shut its own lots tight and sat on them, letting the price climb by the hour the way a man sits on a full cistern in a burning town. So the district woke to find its greatest mine begging for timber, and every timber source it had ever leaned on gone, burned off, snowed in, or cornered. And the price of 1,000 feet of sound pine climbing past anything a mine superintendent had ever entered in a ledger in his life. And no wood at any price that a man could actually put his hands on and haul. And into that same hard corner, that same week, came the railroad's deadline. The narrow gauge had been creeping up the valley all summer. Grade and survey, stake, and then iron, racing to reach the camp and the smelter before the mountain winter shut the work down. And a railroad reaching for a mining camp does not run on rails alone. It runs on ties, on the tens of thousands of hewn crosties that go down under the iron 8 to the rod, mile after mile, and on the heavy squared trestle timber that carries the grade over every gulch and creek the line has to cross. And all of that is pine, mountains of pine wanted now, wanted before the snow closed the grade, wanted under a contract with a completion date and a bond behind it, and a penalty written in for every day the last mile of iron sat unlaid. The railroad had let that tie and trestle timber out to contractors in the spring, the way railroads do, and one of those contractors was a proud young man named Gideon Locke. And Gideon Locke, that fall, was a man watching his whole life burn down inside itself as surely as the Buckhorn. He came up Junia's Canyon on a spent horse on a bitter forenoon, and she watched him come the way her father had taught her to read anything before she trusted a word of it, not with her heart, which had no particular reason to warm to another man riding up her father's road, but with her eyes. He was young, not 30, and built long and hard the way men are who have swung an axe for their bread before they ever contracted for other men's, and he was dressed a cut, better than a working timberman, and wearing it like a debt. A good coat gone shabby at the cuffs, and his face, under 3 days of stubble, had the particular gray look of a man who has stopped sleeping, because sleeping means lying still with the arithmetic. He got down stiff at her landing and took off his hat, which not many men troubled to do for her, and he did not waste her morning with flattery, because he did not have a morning to waste. He told her his trouble flat, standing at the foot of her flume with the cold creek running its ice-rimmed race beside them. The way she would come to learn, he told everything, a true weight set down plain on the counter for her to see. He had a contract with the railroad for the ties and trestle timber of the last hard grade into the camp, 40,000 ties and the bridge stuff besides, due under bond before the pass closed. He had bought his standing pine in the spring off a timberman up the east benches, paid earnest money on it, gambled the whole contract on it. And that pine was the pine the slash fire had burned to ash 3 weeks past, gone, every stick of it, and the man he had bought it from broke and vanished, and the syndicate's lots shut against him at a price that would eat his profit and his margin and the last of his own money too. He was, he said, a ruined man by every figure he could work. The bond forfeit, the penalty running, his name, which was the only capital a young contractor truly owns, about to be worth exactly nothing on any railroad in the mountains, unless somewhere in the whole snowed-in, burned-off, bought-up district there was sound pine a man could still get his hands on before the pass closed. And he had heard, down at the wagon yard, from a freighter who had heard it from a drover who had it off old Silas Orne himself, a thing he had ridden up 2,000 feet of bad grade on the strength of, and was half ashamed to be asking a slip of a girl on the porch of a dugout. Was it true there was gettable pine in Calder's Folly? Not standing pine. Every fool knew the folly stood black with pine. That had never been the joke. Gettable pine. Pine a man could actually get down out of that box canyon and onto a wagon, which every soul in the camp for 8 years had sworn to a certainty could never, ever be done. Junia Calder set down the peavey she had been carrying and looked at him a moment. This gaunt, proud stranger at the end of himself on her father's landing, and then she did not answer him with her mouth. She answered him the way her father would have, which was to turn and walk him 10 steps to where he could see up the throat of the canyon, and let the works do the talking. And there it stood, the thing the camp had laughed at Absalom Calder for 8 years of Sundays without ever once riding up to look at, the log flume, timbered true and running with cold water, climbing away up the steep creek out of sight into the pines, and up at the head of it, dim through the snow frost, the raised splash dam holding back its banked head of water, dark and deep, and along the flume, at 3 ordered landings stepped down the canyon wall, the decked pine, hundreds of thousands of board feet of sound straight mountain pine, felled and limbed and bucked to length and stacked in ranked decks all through the off-season by one girl and a mule waiting on the water. She let him look at it until she saw the arithmetic change behind his gray face, saw the ruined man understand in one long breath that he was not looking at a fool's rock at all, but at the one full timber deck in a district where every other stick was ash or under snow or locked in a Denver vault. Then she told him, level and unhurried, the terms of the thing, Because a desperate man needs an order laid down more than he needs a kindness. Yes, she said, there was gettable pine, more gettable pine than his railroad and the buckhorn together could swallow before the thaw. But he would take it her way, down her flume, on her count, at her price, or he would not take a stick of it at all, and the first thing he would learn, before ever a log moved, was that her water ran her canyon, not his hurry. And Gideon Locke did the thing that told her, before she knew one other true thing about him: the whole shape of the man. He did not argue that he was the contractor and she the girl. He did not bristle at taking the say-so of a 19-year-old on the ground he'd come to buy. He looked at the flume and the decked pine and the banked dam, and he asked her how, not who told her she could run his drive. How? And she told him. And telling him she watched him take it in the way a starving man takes bread, whole and grateful and fast, because it was right, and he was timberman enough to see that it was right. The pine came down the flume in ordered drives, she said, not in a flood and not all at once. You did not open the splash dam and shove a whole landing of logs into the chute together, because a flume packed solid with logs is a flume that jams, and a jam in a running flume backs its water in a heartbeat and bursts the trough clean off the trestles and smashes a winter's work into kindling down 100 yards of canyon, and then no one's timber comes down at all. You sent them down in strings, she said, spaced and counted, a measured drive at a measured head of water. So the logs ran free and fast down the whole length of the flume, and shot out clean at the landing and were caught and pulled aside before the next string came. You fed the dam and drew the dam and reed the creek by the hour, and never once let the chute carry more than she was built to carry. And done that way the flume ran all day and never smashed, and the landing never jammed, and the pine came off the mountain in a steady counted river. Order it, she said, and every stick comes down whole, and you load out clean. Rush it. Try to drown a season's cut down the chute in a week because the railroad's baying at your heels, and you lose the flume and the logs and the whole canyon in one afternoon, and then the buckhorn stays dark and the pass closes on your bare grade. Locke took it in one breath, the whole of it, and she saw him already fitting his desperation to the discipline of it rather than against it. And something in her that had stood braced a long while eased by 1 degree. She set her price that same hour, and she set it the way her father had drilled into her past, all forgetting, fair, and written, and then not moved off of. She had lain awake more than one cold night that fall doing the sum a harder soul would have done, that a mind begging to save its own drowned ore, and a contractor with a bond forfeit at his back, and a railroad with a penalty ticking, would pay anything, everything, would empty their pockets and mortgage their names for sound pine, because there was no other pine to be had at any distance a wagon could reach before the snow. She could have named a price per 1,000 board feet that would have stripped the buckhorn to its collar and left Gideon Locke ruined by her hand as surely as the fire had nearly ruined him, and every man of them would have paid it and thanked her. Because the only other article on the table was to stand in the cold and watch the mine die and the contract forfeit. She had done that sum, in ink, and then she had drawn a line through it, because it was her father's rule become her own, that a figure a person can stand behind for the whole of their life is worth more than a figure that fattens them for one hard winter and shames the ledger it is written in ever after. She named a fair price by the 1,000 board feet, low enough that a burned mine and a broke contractor could pay it and still come out the far side of the winter hole, high enough that it counted, that it was a business and not a mission. And she opened her father's ledger there on the landing and wrote it at the head of a fresh page in her small square upright hand. Under the last flow figure, Absalom Calder had ever set down. The first line in the whole book that was money moving toward her, and not money she had driven out like nails. And when Locke, who had come up the grade braced to be gouged and was grateful past speech to be dealt with straight, tried to press more on her than the figure, tried to tell her, rough and honest, what that pine was truly worth to a man in his corner, tried to round it up in her favor out of sheer relief, she took the fair price and pushed the rest back across the log with the flat of her hand. The price was the price, she told him. It was written down, and she turned the ledger and showed him the line, the head of the column and the figure under it in ink, and she said the thing that ran her canyon without her ever raising her voice, write it down. And it cannot shift on you in the night, and no man can ever say afterward you took him while he was down. He looked at that line a long moment, that gray, ruined, grateful man, and she watched him take the whole rule of her house the way he had taken the plan for the water. Whole. Like a man who has been hunting his entire hard scrabble life for one solid thing to stand on, and has just felt stone come up under his boot. The drives began the next morning and did not stop, save Sundays, until the pass closed. She hired men off the camp to work the landings and tend the flume and load the wagons and skid the cot logs, and here was where the year turned its private joke over quietly in her hands, because the men who came up the great hat in hand looking for winter wages on the Folly Rock were a good half of them, the very men who had leaned on the mercantile porch and asked Absalom Calder across the years, grave and friendly, whether he meant to log the wind this year or only pasture it. She knew two of them by their faces from the days her father was alive to be laughed at. Not a word was said about any of it, on either side. Every man of them drew her fair wage and worked her flume by her count and hauled her pine down the valley to the Buckhorn's re-timbering gangs and Locke's tie camps both. And the not saying was its own kind of ledger, a column that balanced without a single figure ever written into it, and she left it exactly where it lay, because she had a use for those men now, and it was not to make them eat their old laughter. She had no room in her that winter for spite, and no hour to spend on it. She had two hungry deliveries running off one canyon at once, the mine wanting heavy squared stuff for its sets and stalls, the railroad wanting ties by the 10,000, and bridge timber for the trestles, and she fed them both off her ordered drives, reading the creek and the dam and the daily board feet the way her father's notebook had taught her the flume could carry, never once overrunning the chute. So that where the whole district saw only shortage there, came steadily down out of Calder's Folly a counted river of sound pine. Every 1,000 feet of it entered in ink at a fair price against the name of the mine or the man that took it. It was on one of those hard, bright mornings, with the creek running full and black between its ice shelves and a drive of logs shooting the flume, that the canyon nearly took a man from her. And she met the second test of that winter the same way she met all of them, by knowing the true thing where the folk wisdom around her knew the comfortable wrong one. There was a young fellow on her flume crew, a straw-headed camp boy of maybe 18 named Micah, who tended the middle landing, and he went into the creek, a jammed log on the lip of the flume, a peavy thrown wrong, a bad step on the ice, and he was in the race, in water running straight off the snow, and barely kept from freezing by its own hurry, and by the time two men had him out by the collar downstream he had been in it long enough. They carried him up to the landing fire blue-lipped and slack, his soaked clothes already stiffening, shuddering in great slow waves, and then, worse, going still, his words come loose and thick and wandering, his eyes not fixing on any face, and the crew did for him at once, out of the goodness of their hearts, the two things that would have killed him. One had the whiskey jug uncorked and tipped at the boy's teeth before Joinia crossed the landing, and two more were dragging him up against the roaring bank of the fire and stripping to pile their coats on, and set to rubbing the life back into his dead white hands and feet, which is exactly what a man's whole nature tells him to do for the cold, and exactly what the cold prays he will do. Junia Calder went in among them and stopped it, level and unexplaining, the way she stopped anything that was headed wrong. "No whiskey," she said, and took the jug out of the boy's slack mouth with her own hand. No fire like that, and no rubbing his hands and feet. She had learned the truth of the deep cold the way her father learned everything, by watching it plain and writing down what was so and not what folks said was so. That the whiskey a man pours down a freezing body only opens its heart blood to the skin to be robbed of its last warmth. That a killing chill sits deepest in the core of a man and not in his hands, and that if you throw his frozen limbs against a roaring fire or scrub the cold blood in them back toward his heart too fast, that inrush of cold turns his heart to stone in his chest at the very moment he seemed to be saved. So she did it the slow, patient, right way, the only way, against every muttering instinct on that landing. She had them cut the soaked, stiff clothes off him and dry him hard with wool and get him out of the wind into the lee of the log deck, and she wrapped him warm and dry from the middle outward, chest and belly, and the great pulse of his throat, and under the arms, and at the groin where the deep blood runs, warming the core of him first, and letting his cold hands and feet come back last and slow of their own accord. She built the fire down to a steady kind heat set well off him rather than a scorching bank against him. And when at last he could hold his head and swallow true, she gave him water first, and then broth off the crew's pot warm and not hot, in slow sips and not in floods, and she sat by him working the cold up out of him by the hour the way you bring a flow measurement down by the hour, watching and not hurrying, until somewhere in the long middle of that afternoon the shudder came back into him hard and honest, which is the body remembering how to fight the cold instead of surrendering to it, and then eased, and his eyes came up off the wool and found the underside of the log deck, and then found her, and he asked her, thick and wondering, where he was, and she told him he was up on the folly and it had pulled him out of the creek, and the men standing in the deck mouth let go a breath together. The whiskey stayed corked. The boy rode for her canyon crew 3 winters after that, sound as the pine. And through all of it, through the drives and the wages and the 2 deliveries and the near drowning, Gideon Locke did the one thing that no other man who came up that grade all winter thought to do. And it was the thing that told her he was cut different from the whole marveling run of them. The others marveled. The mine men and the freighters and the hired hands stood at her flume and looked from the running chute to the decked pine to the banked dam and said over and over some slack-jawed shape of the same thing, that a girl had done this, that there was gettable pine in Calder's Folly after all, that they never in their lives would have believed it, and their wonder, kindly meant every time, sat on her exactly the way the whole camp's old laughter had sat on her father, as one more man deciding out loud what she was to be allowed to have done. But Locke did not marvel. He had a contract to fill and his name to buy back out of the fire, and he knew that neither one got done by standing at a rail admiring a woman. So on the second morning he came to her at the splash dam with his good coat off and his sleeves shoved up over forearms, corded like a man who had earned his contracts before he wore them. And he asked her plainly what needed doing and where he could lay his back into it. And when she pointed, he went. He did not do it as a courtesy to be paid back in her softening toward him. He did it as a timberman learns a machine he means to trust his whole ruin to. He learned the flume joint by joint that winter, on his knees in the cold water with his hands in the works, where the trestles wanted shimming under the load, how the splash dam gate had to be drawn and eased and drawn to hold a steady head, how to read from the sound of the chute alone when a drive was running heavy and back it off before it packed, how the caught logs had to be pulled and decked at the landing in the same breath they shot clear so the next string had open water to run into. He learned it not by being told a thing twice, but by watching her do it once and then doing it himself, until inside of 10 days he knew the whole cold, quiet machine of that canyon the way she knew it, by the sweat he had left frozen in every joint of it, and she felt the braced thing in her ease a second degree, because there is a particular loneliness to having built a right thing alone that no other soul can see the inside of, and it went out of her that winter one joint at a time, as a proud, ruined man knelt in her flume with his hands in her ice water and asked her, not to be told how clever she was, but only how the fall of the canyon carried the pine down. And then he began to do the thing that would matter longest of all, though neither of them named it yet. Every load of ties he hauled down to the grade. Every talk with a railroad man at the tie camps and the wagon yard and the freight office, he carried the plain word of the canyon down the whole length of the line the way one honest man tells another where the sound timber is, that there was gettable pine on Calder's Folly, more than the camp had dreamed, delivered sure down a girl's flume at a fair price and a straight count, and word of that kind, on a snowbound line starved for timber, runs faster and further than any wagon rolls. She did not thank him for it. She only turned, that night by the lantern in the dugout, with the cold water sounding its low, steady race under everything the way it always did, to a fresh page of her father's ledger, and entered the day's board feet against the buckhorn and against Locke's railroad contract both. String of pine on string of pine come down whole out of the Folly. Every 1,000 feet at the fair price, written plain. And she sat a moment and looked at the book in the lamplight and understood that it had turned, quietly and for good, somewhere in that burning boom of a winter, from the thing it had been all through the off-season, a long column of what she had spent, money and sweat and her father's last dollars driven out into the dark rock like nails, with nothing yet come back. It was not that anymore. Every line on the open page now ran the other way. It had become, page after filling page in her small, square, upright hand, the record of what she was owed, and outside in the frozen dark the flume ran on its cold errand down the canyon, and 2 miles below her the re-timbering gangs went back down into the wet ruin of the buckhorn on her pine, and off east along the grade Gideon Locke's tie camps stacked her pine into the ties that would carry the iron into the camp before the pass closed, and the whole hard logic of that district had begun, without the camp yet quite understanding it, to turn itself over inside a single winter. But that was the next thing, and the ledger only knew, that night, that it had stopped being a book about spending and become a book about being owed. Timber news travels the way a log travels down a running creek. It goes where the water goes, and it does not hurry, and once it has run the length of a country, it has changed the price of everything it passed. By the time the first ordered drive of Junia Calder's pine had gone down the flume and up onto the flat cars and off north behind the panting little narrow-gauge engine, the whole valley knew a thing it had spent 8 years refusing to believe, which was that there was gettable timber coming off Calder's Folly, sound straight pine sluiced down on water power for a fair price by the 1,000, board feet, written in a book. And in the working out of that one fact, the entire logic of the district turned itself over inside a single burning season, the way a whole hillside of snow will hang all winter and then go over in an afternoon when the one right thing lets go. For years, the arithmetic of timber in that camp had been as plain and settled as the mountains it stood under. The good timber was the near timber. The accessible slopes close above the town where a man could throw in a skid road and snake logs down to the valley mills with an ox team in an afternoon. And those slopes had been logged first and logged hard and were mostly slashed and stumped and cut out now. Gone to blackened stumpland and second growth not fit for a mine cap. What sound timber was left standing stood high and back, up on the cold benches and the far ridges, and the biggest and best of it had been quietly bought up years back by the syndicate. The Eastern money that owned the 2 deep mines and a good half the paper in the valley besides, bought it and held it, sure that when the near slopes gave out the whole camp would have to come to them for every stick of it and pay whatever the syndicate cared to ask. It was a good plan in the way a great many plans are good, which is to say it was good in every season but the one that came. Because the syndicate's holdings stood high, and the winter came early and hard and deep, and the snow shut the far benches and the high roads under 6 and 8 and 10 feet of it, and the syndicate that owned a mountain of the finest pine in the district owned it the way a man owns money sewn into a coat at the bottom of a lake, really and truly his, and no earthly use to him at all. They could not get an ox up there. They could not get a sled down. Their timber stood green and enormous and worth a fortune under a winter that would not let a living soul near it until spring, and spring was the one thing the district did not have to spare. For the need had come all at once, the way Silas Orne had stood on the mercantile porch and promised it would, while the camp laughed at the old timber cruiser and the Folly Girl both. The great fire had gutted the timbering deep in the Buckhorn, the biggest mine in the valley, and burned out its sets and its lagging and its square sets 3 levels down, and killed the workings dead until every foot of it could be retimbered new. And a mine cannot be retimbered on promises. It is retimbered on sound heavy pine hauled to the collar by the wagon load, day on day, or it stands flooded and idle and eats its owners alive with every shift it does not turn. And in the very same weeks the railroad came racing up the valley against the winter, the narrow gauge that had been only a survey line of stakes creeping up the grade when Junia's father was alive, now a grade and a roadbed and a laid-down mile of iron a day. Driving to reach the camp before the deep snow closed the pass, and a railroad is built on ties and trestle timber the way a mine is built on sets, a mountain of them, thousands of ties to the mile, cut and hewn and delivered to the railhead on a deadline that the contract fixed in ink and the weather would not move. The mine had to have timber, and the road had to have timber, both at once, both now, and every ordinary source of it in the whole district had gone out from under them in the same season, the near slopes cut out, the far benches snowed in, the syndicate's fortune locked under the drifts. Every ordinary source but one. There was one holding in all that country where the timber stood tall and sound and got itself down to the valley grade cheap and steady in the dead of winter, on nothing but the fall of the water and the head banked behind a splash dam. One place the snow could not lock, because its road was a running creek that the cold could not altogether freeze, and it was the roadless, boulder-choked box canyon of pine that the whole camp had called worthless for 8 years, and Calder's Folly to the dead man's face. So the whole standing of the district turned over. The men who had owned the good timber owned snowdrifts. The men who had bought the sure thing had bought a locked door, and the girl who had been handed the one holding nobody else would take at a gift owned the only pine on the market that could move. And it moved down her flume in ordered drives all through the cold, while the syndicate's watchman sat idle on a mountain of frozen money and cursed the sky. Down in the town, in the squared stone front of his bank, Bartholomew Rennick sat with the season's paper stacked in front of him and read the ruin off it the way only a banker reads a bad year, which is all at once and from every side. His vault was stuffed with notes, and the notes were written against things that had stopped being worth the ink, against mine stock in workings that stood flooded and dark, against timber claims up on benches no man could reach till the thaw, against the syndicate's own grand paper that had looked in the autumn like the soundest security in the valley and looked now like a promise to deliver snow. He had lent on the near slopes, and the near slopes were stumps. He had lent on the deep mines, and the deep mines had burned. He had lent, most of all, on the plain, unquestioned assumption that timber was a thing you got where it had always been got, down the skid roads in the good months by the strength of an ox, and the assumption had gone through the ice under him, and the paper it held up was worth about what he had once slid across his counter for the folly, which was to say next to nothing. And Bartholomew Rennick understood next to nothing better than most men understood their own names, because the reading of a column down to the place where it quit being a number and turned into the truth was the one thing he had ever truly been able to do. It did not take him long, therefore, to see where the only sound money in the district had gone to lie, and it did not take the syndicate long either. Once the Eastern men had done their own cold sum and seen that the one article they could not corner, could not freeze out, could not wait for, was a canyon of water-borne pine held by a girl of 19 in a Mackinaw coat who wrote every log down. They wanted it. They had learned the hard way, which was the only way that country ever taught anybody anything, that the thing worth owning was not the finest timber, but the gettable timber, and having learned it, they meant to buy it. And they sent the man who had first laughed her out of his bank to go up the canyon and get it. So Rennick rode up the folly himself. He came up the rough new tote road her drives had worn along the creek on a hired horse on a blue iron cold afternoon, with the pines standing black and heavy with snow on either hand, and the sound of the water running under the ice everywhere below him. And he came the way such men come when they have been humbled and mean to carry it off as though they hadn't. Hearty, admiring, full of talk, his hat coming off his balding head the moment he rode up into the landing and saw with his own eyes what a winter of the Folly Girl's work had made. And there was a great deal to see. There was the splash dam standing squat and enormous across the throat of the canyon, with its banked head of black water behind it, and its gate rigged to trip on a chain, and the log flume marching down the creek on its stone and timber piers, and the chute where the decked pine went roaring down to the landing in ordered drives that never once jammed the run nor smashed the works, because she ran them her way, and her way was written down. There was a mountain of sound soul logs decked along the grade under the snow, sorted and scaled and tallied, some marked with the mine's brand for sets and lagging, and some hewn square already for the road's ties, and a crew of the very men who had laughed at her father working them down to the cars, with their breath standing white in the cold. There was smoke off the stone and log house she had dug into the canyon wall, and a barn, and the mule, and the whole snug working shape of a place that a whole town had sworn to a man could never be anything but a dead girl's joke on a dead man. Rennick turned his hat in his soft gloved hands and admired all of it out loud, and Junia let him admire it, standing there in her father's Mackinaw, with her scaling rule under her arm and saying little, because she had learned from that same father that a man who has ridden a long cold way to buy will always talk himself down to his real figure if you only let the wind in the pines fill the silences for him. And talk himself along Rennick did, from admiration into regret, such a hard winter, such a shame about the near slopes, a tragedy really about the fire, and from regret into business, and the business came laddering out of him at last in a rising run of figures. First hundreds of dollars for the canyon and the water rights and the works, and then, when her face did not so much as flicker, 1,000, and then 2, And then the names of the serious Eastern men who stood behind the 2,000, laid down one after another across the top of a saw log like cards he was dead sure would take the trick. She heard him all the way down the ladder. She did not cut in on him, and she did not warm to him, and she did not once let him think he stood nearer to it than he did. And when he had finished, when he had set down his thousands and his syndicate and his last hearty, confident smile and stood there in the snow waiting, she wiped her hands slow on her coat, and she went to the shelf inside the door, and she brought out the ledger. It was a heavier book now than the thin thing she had opened by lantern light her first night in the canyon. She set it on the head of the sorted deck between them, and she turned it around to face him. And she walked him down through the whole of the season, line by line, in her small, square, upright hand, the way you would walk a slow child through a sum. Here was the first drive down the flume, so many thousand board feet, scaled and delivered and paid, and the price by the thousand and the date. Here was the Buckhorn's account, set after set of re-timbering pine hauled to the collar through the worst of the cold, and the road's account under it, the ties by the hundred and the trestle sticks by the length, every one a figure, and every figure in ink. Here was the young tie contractor's bill, run up when his own timber failed him, settled fair and initialed. Here were the wages of the crew she now kept, men off that same mercantile porch, paid on time and signed for. The count ran down the page and turned the leaf and ran on. Drive after drive of sound pine brought down out of a canyon the whole valley had priced at nothing. And when Rennick's small, shrewd eyes had gone all the way to the bottom of it, he understood exactly what he was looking at. Because reading a column was the one true thing he could do. He was looking at a worthless folly. In the one winter, every sound timber holding in the district lay burned or snowed under or cut out, earning down its pages like the two best claims in the mountains laid end to end. Then Junia Calder named him her price. She set it level, without any heat in it at all, the way her father had taught her, that a figure once set down cannot shift on you in the night. She told the banker she would sell him the canyon, the water, the dam, the flume, the standing pine, the whole of it, for exactly the sum he had first slid across his counter for the folly in the thin cold light of the spring, his own $40, not 1 cent above it, and she would sign it over to him gladly and glad of the bargain the very day the creek ran dry and the last pine on the place came down. Rennick, who could not read weather and could not read timber and could not read a girl in a man's coat, but who could read that, understood it all the way to the floor. He understood that she had handed him back his own contempt at its own price and turned it into a joke that would be told at every landing and railhead and wagon yard from the pass to the plains, and that the joke was airtight, because the day that creek ran dry and that pine gave out the canyon would be worth his $40 and not a copper more. And the creek was fed off the high snows and the deep rock and was not going to run dry, and the pine stood thick enough up that box canyon to feed a district for 50 years. He stood a moment with it in the cold. Then he closed the ledger gentle and slid it back across the log to her, and put his hat back on his balding head, and said something admiring about the fine works she had built, and rode back down the tote road slower than he had come up it, past the decks of her sorted pine and the men loading it onto the cars, down toward a town full of paper written against dead claims. There was one more account that came up the canyon that winter to be settled, and Junia settled it the same way, in the same hand, at the same price. Lavinia came. The valley sawmill lot and the home place that the will had handed her whole and shining had gone the way of every near thing that season. The mill sat idle in its yard, for the plainest reason a mill can sit idle, which is that it had no logs, the near slopes above it cut out, and the far timber snowed off, and the syndicate's price for a stick of it more than a mortgaged widow could raise. A sawmill with no timber is a great deal of iron standing in the cold eating its owner's credit, and the stepmother, upright as ever, in her good town coat gone shabby at the cuff, came up the folly road she had once named a folly to buy the one thing the folly could sell that her fine inheritance no longer could. She came for timber. And Juniah scaled her out her saw logs at the trough side of the landing at the very same fair price by the 1,000 that every other soul in the district paid that winter. No cent added on, not for the bolted door nor the pressed deed, nor the cutting kindness of take your father's folly and see how it timbers you. And no cent forgiven off it either. No stick of it discounted for the blood between them. She wrote Lavinia's scale into the ledger in the same small square letters as all the rest, and took the same fair coin for it. And the two women did not say a great deal across the cold deck, because there was not a great deal left to say that a plain fair price did not say better than any speech. And the town, when it heard of it, read it exactly right, the way that country always read a thing done plainly and set down in ink, a plain fair price. No spite salted into it, and no past forgiven out of it, meant the account between them was closed and squared and paid in full, no balance carried forward on either side. Ever again. That was the whole of the reckoning between Juniah Calder and the woman who had shut the door on her, and it was enough. And it was done. Through the whole of the banker's visit, the young tie contractor had been up at the dam getting the head of water ready for the next day's drive. He had heard the hired horse come, and he had seen it go, and he had not come down, because the deed was in her name and the fight was hers, and he knew both of those things to the bone, and would not have insulted her by standing at her shoulder for a fight she had no need of help winning. That was the measure of the man, and she had taken his measure a long way back, in the worst week of the crisis, when he alone among all the dozens who marveled at her works that winter had not stood at the rail admiring her, but had shoved up his sleeves and asked to be used, learning her water machine joint by the sweat he left in it, until he knew the trip of the dam gate and the fall of the flume, and the ordering of a drive the way she knew them, and had begun to carry the true word of the canyon down the whole length of the rail line, not as a wonder, but the way one honest man tells another where the sound timber is. He asked her plainly, one blue evening near the end of the winter drives, with the pines standing still and the creek running its low, steady sound under the ice the way it always did under everything. He put it the way a timberman puts a thing, in the count and the plain words of the work. He said he had come out of his ruin with his contract filled and his name whole and a saved share of sound timber of his own now, wages and profit turned into standing pine, and that his share and his half a name were both hers if she had any use for them, and he would understand her well enough if she hadn't. And she said yes plain, the way you call a true figure off the scale rule. No more voice put into it than the thing was worth, and no less. And that was more than enough, because they had both long since learned to hear the truth in a plain figure and to trust nothing that came dressed up louder than it was. They married at the splash dam, among the pines, because there was no other church on that place, and no truer one anywhere, and the whole low country of the mountains stood up white and enormous around them for the wedding. Old Silas Orne gave her away, the gaunt sun-blackened timber cruiser, who had read the whole hard winter coming off the porch while the camp laughed at him too, standing up beside her with his shapeless hat in his cracked hands, and giving her over to the contractor like a man handing on a thing whose worth he had known before anybody else in the country would credit it. The young flume man she had rewarmed the slow right way out of the icy creek, who would ride for the canyon outfit for years, stood up sound and brown on the other side. And under the few plain words and the still pines ran the low sound of the creek coming down off the high snows, and the deep rock, which was the truest voice at that wedding, and the one they had both come to trust the most. Now let the years go, the way they go in that high country, in long snows and long thaws. The boom did not last. A boom never does. The railroad reached the camp and went on over the pass and quit needing its mountain of ties. The buckhorn was retimbered at last and ran a while, and then the ore pinched out the way ore always finally does. And the deep mines shut one by one, and the Eastern money folded its paper and rode the cars back east. And the roaring dust and whistle year that had made a fortune in one burning winter thinned and quieted and passed on the way such years pass, and left the valley to the long weather again. But the canyon never changed what that one hard winter had made it. The creek came down cold and steady off the high snows in the boom years, and the quiet years exactly the same, scaled and written down, and so the folly stayed the one sure thing in an unsure country. When the mines shut, the settlers came, and the ranchers wanting fence and barn timber, and the towns down the valley wanting sawn lumber to build with, and everyone who needed sound pine and a straight scale came to the water-borne canyon that never failed. Around the landing over the years there rose a real mill and a store and a long bunkhouse, and then the frame houses of the men who worked them, and the place got its name written onto the county maps and the freight schedules the way a true thing gets written into the working papers of a country, until nobody left alive remembers it was ever a joke. A mill town, small and sure and green among the pines, and its name on the maps was Calder's. And behind the counter of the store in Calder's, framed under glass where every traveler who came in to trade could read it, hung the first page of the first ledger, the one begun by lantern light in a stone-cold canyon the night a girl came into her worthless inheritance. A flow and board-feet figure in a dead woodsman's hand at the top of it, and below it, in a young woman's small, square, upright letters, the whole beginning of the account. There was a tale that went with the framed page, and the storekeeper's people told it for 3 generations to anyone who asked why a ledger sheet hung where a picture ought to hang. A banker once priced this canyon at $40, laughing, and rode home satisfied he had done a foolish girl a kindness by even offering. And inside the year he came back up the grade with $2,000 and a syndicate behind him, hat in his soft hands. Because one burning winter had taught the whole world what the pine in this canyon was worth. And the girl heard him all the way out, and turned her ledger around to face him, and offered him back his own $40 for the whole of it, payable, she said, the day the creek runs dry and the last pine falls. And the creek, the tale always ended, with a nod toward the low sound of water you can still hear running under the floor of the mill if you stop your talk and listen. The creek has not run dry yet, and the pines are standing yet. Junia and her contractor ran the canyon together for the rest of their long lives, side by side and written down, and there was never any lucky strike in the whole of it, never a vein of silver under the caprock nor a fortune fallen out of the sky. Only patient water in a running creek and patient pine on a steep hillside that her father had found and proved and left to the one child who would believe a figure over a fashion, and 10,000 small competent decisions, day on windy day, to bring a sound thing down out of a hard place where the whole county had sworn nothing could ever be gotten out at all. That was all it ever was. That was everything. And on any hard winter day still, when the snow shuts the high roads and the far benches lie locked and useless under the drifts, You can hear the water running down that canyon under the ice, steady and sure and carrying its ordered pine down to the mill, the way it has carried it down since a girl of 19 banked the first head behind the dam, patient and faithful, and running yet. Thank you for spending this long winter evening up in the Pine Canyon with us, and for staying through to the end of Junia's story. If it warmed something in you, if you believe, as she did, that patience and a quiet, steady faith in the work of your own two hands can bring a sound living thing down out of the barest, steepest, most worthless-looking ground, then take a moment to let us know down in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight, and who it was that taught you to write the true figure down and stand behind it. If stories like this one are a comfort to you, settle in and subscribe so the next quiet tale from the hearth finds its way to you when the wind comes up cold. Rest easy now, keep your own lamp burning kind, and we will see you again by the fire on the next long evening. Until then, be well.